Hi, good evening. I'm Dr. Philip McMillan, and I've been focused on COVID 19 since early 2020, primarily looking at autoimmunity as the primary pathology in the disease. And so, as I've continued that research journey, it has caused me to see many unusual patterns around the spike protein. Now, anyone who has been recently following some of the research that I've been looking at and looking at the research papers would have seen a very important breakthrough paper with regards to Japanese researchers looking at Omicron as being lab made, and also a recent publication about the VAX spike protein being in circulation for over 180 days. All of those things together makes me very concerned about the risk to the population about infertility. It's what I call the infertility nightmare. And this is part of what I'm raising awareness of for you, please. This will be in 2 days' time on Thursday. If you're watching the video afterwards, there should be a link to see it afterwards. I'm still in the process of determining exactly what I'll be doing in the agenda, and that's part of what I'll be talking about: fertility fundamentals, mechanisms of impact, ethical and societal considerations. And I'm coming from this from a medical point of view, not so much an obstetric point of view, because I'm not into fertility management, but I'm looking at what can happen if autoimmunity becomes a significant part of the disease. And so, part of what I'll be highlighting today is a very important paper with regards to the interaction of the spike protein and estrogen receptors. And that would fit into the changes that could be occurring, because you have to remember, depending on where you are in the world, up to over 40% of women had seen changes in their menstrual period, which is very, very sensitive hormonal balance. And so that was something that should have been investigated very thoroughly. But for some reason, I can't explain why, it didn't seem to be a priority. These things may come back to bite us if we don't have clarity on exactly what could be happening. So I'm just sharing with you this paper here. So this was actually published in November 2022. So this is not recently published. It has had over 10,000, almost 11,000 downloads already. And essentially what they were looking at was that the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein binds and modulates estrogen receptors. So it's important to know it doesn't directly bind to estrogen, but it binds to the estrogen receptors. But at the same time, without the estrogen receptors, you can't have the effect of estrogen to have an impact on a cell, because normally estrogen gets into the cell, binds to the receptor inside the cell, and then goes into the nucleus of the cell to trigger the production of whatever action it needs to have. So, estrogen and the estrogen receptor are very, very closely intertwined, and anything that impacts on it is likely to be very significant. So, when we look in more detail at the information in terms of the abstract for this, they were finding that there were interactions between the spike protein and other proteins occurring after infection. They didn't understand it. So they then profiled the binding of the spike protein, that's the S protein here, against over 9,000 human proteins. And they found an interaction between the spike protein and the human estrogen receptor, ER alpha. So when they've noticed that, they then did a few more tests looking at hamsters to try and understand what was going on. And they were looking at the impact actually not just in the context of the ovaries or in terms of the uterus, but estrogen is actually important in terms of immunity. So part of their concern was this a reason why men had a higher risk of death with severe COVID 19? Was it to do with the estrogen receptor? I mean, that was an area that we had covered very early on in the pandemic. And we just said simply ACE2, serum levels of ACE2 are closely tied to gender, males have higher levels than females, and so therefore, in our view, it made them at a higher risk of an autoimmune response. But it could certainly be that estrogen was a part of the whole process in terms of the increased severity of disease in men. So here you have another image. This is from the same paper. And again, you see here, this in green is the spike protein here. And this green spike protein here is binding to the estrogen receptor. And you can see here, this is just a similar diagram showing it close up. So the estrogen receptor binds to this part of the spike protein. Now, based on the shape of this protein, I think that down here is the ACE2 binding domain. So it binds to different points. This here would be the furin cleavage site. This is where furin would bind. So at different points on the spike protein, you have proteins interacting. And my question would be simple: if you have binding of the spike protein to estrogen receptors and you have the immune system recognizing this as a whole protein, could it make autoantibodies to the estrogen receptor? The simple question that I asked essentially from the start of the pandemic, that was the mechanism that we said for causing ACE2 autoantibodies in the context of severe COVID 19. So the pattern is the same, and it's a similar question to what we had asked before. When we look a little bit more at the discussion in the paper, they were looking at E2, estradiol is the most potent endogenous estrogen and is highly selective for the estrogen receptor. And without it, without estradiol, the estrogen receptors exist within target cells in an inactive form. And so, therefore, without the ability for these estrogen receptors to bind to estrogen, so if they were bound by the spike protein, that would impact the ability that they have to work at a cellular level. It makes me wonder if this is relevant even in the context of long COVID, because women seem to be more prone to long COVID symptoms than men. Could part of it just be due to almost a perimenopausal impact on the estrogen receptor for people who are already going into menopause? It almost speeds up the process and causes a more rapid drop in estrogen levels, and therefore technically brings on an earlier and more severe menopausal symptoms. So these are the kinds of things that need to be explored. And that's part of what I'll be looking at as well in the presentation. And again, this is just to remind you that it is coming up in another 2 days. And I just encourage you to join us. It's free. And I just want to say thank you to the donors. There's some people who have donated. Really appreciate it, because it just makes the work feel feel rewarded, because it does take quite a bit of time to do the research, put together the presentations, host it on platforms, share it out, get the images. There's a lot of work that goes behind the scenes, and the support is really appreciated, even though I didn't specifically ask for it. So just highlighting those people who donate and donate on a regular basis, I really do notice it and I really do appreciate it. So just in summary, reminding you that we are into the category of the unknown unknowns. What that means is that we have a situation where we're starting to realize that the spike protein circulates for much longer than was thought. If the spike protein circulates for longer periods of time and it binds to specific proteins in the body, what impact will that have on the function of the body? Remember, a lot of people are looking and saying, listen, well, if there are going to be problems, they would appear within a year or two. I disagree. If you are talking about autoimmunity, it can sometimes take 5 to 10 years before you start to see the real impact of what has occurred. We are in very serious times. My concern is that if we don't get this right quickly, there is no opportunity for mitigation. And if we cannot mitigate, the longer term impacts on the population and population health could be quite horrendous. Again, thank you for listening. I look forward to sharing with you more information in the near future. Have a great evening.